Today we're going to deal with one or two very important questions. Specifically, how do you measure your success or progress as a game developer? What's important to you? And on that same note, what do you want out of game development? Those two are, of course, closely interconnected. We're going to discuss this in the context of a few personal stories, my path, as well as the path of a few former coworkers who I've followed now for a decade plus through their career trajectories. We're going to pull in some outside references, all kinds of things we're going to talk about, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. And this is something that I really want you to be engaged in actively, not to be just listening today, not just be following along, kind of like spectating, but really be putting yourself into this question of what you want to be looking back on, what's going to make you happy, and what you want out of it. Because I've seen people who didn't consider these ramifications early on run into challenges long term, where they either spent money they wish they hadn't spent years on things they wish they hadn't spent years on, or in other cases, felt great about what they put into their lives and what they got out of it. I want to emphasize, too, that though I've chosen my path in life pretty clearly, that there is no universal right answer for this. Each individual has personal preferences along this spectrum between these options upon different directions. There's no right answer for everybody, but it is to say that it's up to each person to find and choose and follow their own answer. So without further ado, first question I want to bring up, and I'm going to try to keep these stories anonymous. I'm not going to be mentioning their names. This isn't really trying to draw attention to these particular people. This is pulling up people as specific, grounded, real human being case studies for comparison and contrast to what you want out of your life. But again, not to make any judgment about them or their choices or their path. It's just there for illustration. So back when I was, I think my second stint in industry, so 2006, had a couple internships before my full-time job with a big AAA studio. I would actively set appointments and meetings to interview everybody in the company who would talk to me. Executive producers from different teams, lead designers, lead artists, senior artists, entry-level workers from design, engineering, people in QA, people from everywhere in the company, every team, everyone who I just could sit down and talk with me before the day started, during lunchtime, at the end of the day, whatever it was. I fit in. I wanted to talk to soak up as much knowledge as I could. I wanted to find out, as I was at an inflection point in my career, what regrets did they have? How'd they get where they are today? What changes do they see kind of on the horizon? You know, what might they do differently? And just trying to soak all that up. At the time, it was to try to figure out my path. Since then, just like my podcast interviews for Gamketo Community have helped equip me with more stories to help others. But one of these, so the project at the time was on Crunch. We had some sort of upcoming, it might have been Tokyo Game Show or something, some sort of upcoming public demonstration to develop for. And while we're in Crunch, the team would order Middle Eastern food or all kinds of other sort of takeout. They'd have it brought in the evenings. And so one of these evenings, I go to one of our guys, and I'm going to be vague about what his role was, but he's one of the lead design voices on the team. And so I'm like, hey, we're going to have to take a break anyway while we eat dinner before we go back to doing more hours on this project. Do you mind if we just kind of step aside to this little breakout room and just chat while we're eating? He says, sure. Well, let's pick his brain for a little bit. One of my favorite questions to ask these people, many of whom had only ever been in big studios or followed a career trajectory for that. And this guy, for context, had been doing level design professionally since like the 90s on Nintendo 64 games. Very experienced guy. And one of the questions I like to ask was, okay, well, if you could do any game you wanted, if there was no politics around it, if there was no marketing department to convince, if there was no boss to get the approval of to sign the checks, if you could just make any game you wanted, what game would you want to build? And this guy starts describing, again, so context, this is 2006. This is years before Minecraft. This is years before indie games even exploded, along with the Xbox Live Arcade that started around that '06 summer, '07, '08, around that kind of window. This is before the iPhone App Store, before Steam's indie game section blew up. This is before all that. And the game he said he'd like to develop, if it was all up to him and didn't need anybody else's permission in the company, was a game where it's like an isometric view, and you wake up stranded on a randomly generated beach. Randomly generated so that you couldn't learn from a strategy guide or what worked for your friend what's going to work for you. Each time you have to explore. And you got like a shipwreck, and you got to forage for materials and put together a shelter or a lean-to or a little shack for yourself. Find ways to survive, maybe find ways to seek help. But every time it's a unique play experience on an isometric view of just surviving on this island. Thought that was pretty cool. And again, this is actually before the wave of crafting and survivor games took off by several years. He could have been at the front of that curve had he been in a position in his career or his life or his choices to act on it at the time independently, and instead chose to continue working in the company. And again, as we're going to see in a second, doesn't mean he regretted it, but When I caught up with him last year, so a full decade later, 2016, we ran to each other at E3. The guy's hopping from TV interview to TV interview. Clearly, his career has gone successfully by any reasonable person's measure of what that might mean. And so real fast, we're catching up. Again, he's got to rush off, but we're like, hey, it's so great to see you. What's been going on? He asked me what I'm doing. I'm teaching programmers on the internet. I'm making my side games. Did a few little other things, but that's kind of what I'm doing these days. What have you been up to, man? And he says, look it up later. Obviously true. Why he's on TV. He's now the lead creative voice for one of the largest sports franchises in the world. For games franchises, for sports, of course. And, man, you just got to imagine, he has worked his way up the corporate ladder. He is no doubt, I don't know the details, but I can assure you, just from a distance, we know how these things work in companies that size, probably being fairly well compensated for his role in that enormous project, which is played by literally millions and millions, probably tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world. Some of the most played games on earth are these sports franchises. And wow, right? That's pretty amazing, the strides he's made in his career. But that puts me, I don't know, he has got to run off, but it puts in me this moment of reflection on, well, okay, but in that 10 years while he worked his way up the corporate ladder and is again being very well compensated for it, no doubt, and I can see from Facebook feels good about the things he does, he actually didn't in that time ever get to make his beach game. The game he wanted to make, the Survivor game, right? Meanwhile, in that time, I got to work on lots of little games that I wanted to. Every single game I felt like making, I got to make. If I had a theory about, I think a game should be done like this, I got to try it. Now, my games aren't sold on that scale. They haven't earned the level of income he probably is. But I got to build the games I wanted to build. And when I look back on the past decade and see that I got to build the games I wanted to build, I feel good about that in a way that if instead I had worked with a company from the stock price of 15 to 100, but I never got to work on the games I wanted to work on, I personally might not be as happy. And then fairly recently on Facebook, actually, it seems like he was on a family vacation to a beach. Pretty visibly is a big fancy sandcastle that he and I assume his family built, because parts of it seem like some kids worked on it. Parts of it, you get the impression an adult had a hand, because it's a pretty elaborate big sandcastle. He had in his description for that, or comment for that Facebook post, I sure do miss level design. Right? And here's an example of a guy who, when he got started again 20 years ago professionally, had just been building levels for Nintendo 64 games, liked having his elbows deep in that craft of hammering together, in a way, those spaces and those levels. But as he's moved his way up in the administration, he's now probably several layers removed from the part that maybe he enjoyed doing. And the same way as all the time, we'll see teachers who at a systematic level and big bureaucracy love teaching so much that they get promoted out of it and don't get to actually teach students anymore and instead have to administrate and organize things for their teachers or design curriculum or other things that may have a positive impact, but maybe aren't the part of work that they personally enjoy. And so here's the kind of division I'm talking about. A further contrast, even more so than my story, is a brilliant game developer I know, that very cross-functionally skilled guy, building his own games for many years. And when I met him, he was delivering fast food. That was his job. That's how he paid his bills. And I was like, man, why are you not making games professionally? There's companies that would love to utilize your skill sets, your tremendous talent to do good things. And the way he explained it was he wants to be able to build his stuff. Right? He doesn't want a boss telling him what to do. He doesn't want pressure and politics and having to convince coworkers. He wants to be able to just build his things. And as he put it, and this is not to be derogatory towards anybody in their place in life, in the phase of their career or whatever, but he said he'd be perfectly happy. He'd be happier, in fact, bagging groceries as his day job if it meant he could build whatever he wanted at his off hours. Because he knew these stories about people who, once they joined a big studio, like I had, weren't allowed to do their own stuff on the outside, or was frowned upon, or it would be owned by the company, or legal department would say no, or whatever it was. He just wanted to be able to do his own stuff. And there's certainly, again, got to respect that. Doesn't mean that those reach the same level and number of players, but he felt good about what he was building. Does that make sense? And we're all looking for different things out of life. But one thing I really want you to think about is 10 years in the future, when you look back on that time, are you going to feel better if you have had a high-paying career making, and let's be frank, somebody else's games? Games that the boss wanted, games that the customer demanded sequels or follow-ups or ports to, games that investors steered and pushed your direction and pulled your direction towards, or if you found some other way to sustain what you're doing in terms of, frankly, one reason why I've had so much freedom to make my games is some years they've been commercial, some years that I've got business partnerships, some years I find some other way to pay my income, other kinds of work, and I just keep making games that I feel like making. Same thing's true also for lots of people who I meet out there in the game development scene anymore. A lot of them use the same kind of overlapping skills that they use in their game development in a day job that's actually unrelated to games. Maybe they're a server backend programmer, maybe they do website design, maybe they do some sort of project management or consulting related to those sort of roles, maybe they do some sort of marketing work, in some cases they do illustration for hire, other kinds of work, and on the side, they make whatever games they want without answering to anybody. Another coworker that I had at that same studio, his talks when he go to schools contrasted a lot from the kind of talks I would give. Whenever I speak with schools, and I was giving talks at schools even then back in 2006, and obviously today still do a lot of those, my emphasis is always that if you find a way to build a game resourcefully, without needing a big budget, without needing a whole funded team, etc., you can build anything you can imagine. And it may not look like a AAA game, but whatever comes to your mind, you can make that happen. Part of what's so cool about programming games, as opposed to using some sort of Lego snap-together easy tool for kids, is that the answer to the question, can that be done, is always yes. Might involve learning some tricky math, might involve troubleshooting some difficult technical challenges, but the answer is always yes. And in contrast, this other guy, again, former coworker who'd always been in AAA industry studio-size big teams as a designer, the talk he would give at schools was to say, and again, this is different from the first guy, talk he would give at schools was to say, okay, let's imagine you're brought onto the team as a lead designer, which some people think that means you get to make the game you want to make, but not in a studio. He says, okay, lead designer, the executives tell you, all right, we figured out that the market demand right now is for Jar Jar Binks racing. And this was a while ago, so Jar Jar was still a thing because of Phantom Menace. Let's say it's a throwback game in the same way as often games get released decades later to pick up on those waves, maybe when a new Star Wars movie comes out, even without those characters. So suddenly, whether or not you like Jar Jar Binks, or whether or not you even like racing games, your job now as a lead designer on that studio team is to become an expert in Jar Jar Binks, and to become an expert in figuring out what type of racing game would the same demographic that likes Jar Jar Binks enjoy. And like my vague hand-waving guess, having not solved this problem, probably some kind of Mario Kart-ish, right? And then we got the Jar Jar, and then what other characters fit the demographic, and how do we depict Darth Maul in a way that's acceptable for children, and all kinds of things. That's a different kind of design challenge, and it's a respectable challenge. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a profession, for sure. Now, another story I like to draw upon out of these just buckets of examples, another guy who I was in contact with many years ago, and this one I can be more public about because this is a guy who spoke at conferences about this exact example and has spoken in interviews about this exact example. Rod Humble. Guy made The Marriage, an extremely abstract game where there's like a dot that's his husband and a dot that's him as the husband, dot that's his wife, and these shapes change color and size and move based on dynamics of his relationship in their marriage, thus the name of the game, as well as other dots that were like other people at a party and about how proximity to them means certain things emotionally or situationally or developmentally that impact the shapes and dynamics of those in a very abstract, beautiful way. And this was discussed in a game developers conference and experimental gameplay workshops and so on. And at the same time that he did that game, he was the head of EA Maxis's expansion packs for Sims. And in an interview, somebody asked him, they're like, do you ever feel like there's a dissonance, a discontinuity between The Marriage, this clearly art project of a game you're doing, that's a little weird design experiment with literally colored shaped graphics, as compared to shipping furniture for Sims expansion packs? And his answer, which I thought was beautiful, was like, there's a market demand for this kind of work. This kind of work he wants to do for other reasons. It's not because of market demand for it. And that there's no problem, there's no conflict between those two things. Right? You can be a person who at home has deep values as a chef and wants to prepare a certain kind of food, and then for the day job, be a fry cook or whatever else is paying in your area because there's a high demand established for consistent, simple foods that people know how to order. That those two things are not in conflict of helping people get what they want and also having an outlet in your life for doing the things you feel like are worth doing. And where these things come up, right, is that we've got oftentimes when we're deciding what game we're making or how we're making the game that we have already made up our mind to make, decision points come up frequently. And those decision points sometimes diverge. One direction seems like, well, the market seems more likely to pay for this. I've seen more published, provable, successful, sold games that did this. Maybe it's something you don't feel okay about. Maybe it's in-app purchases. Maybe it's some sort of online connectivity back-end feature. Maybe it's people spamming stuff on social media as part of the game that it's high scores lists and stuff. Maybe it's sending people friend invites on Facebook and all that kind of framework. Maybe it's trying to sell people subscriptions to Netflix to get them energy points. Whatever it is, things that maybe aren't part of how the games were when you grew up, playing games, inspired to make games, not what you loved about games, but it seems like where the market action's happening right now. Or on the other side, there's where you can steer away from that stuff and say, yeah, but the game I feel like making, based on what I enjoy playing and what I like about games, is different from those. I want to make a game and sell it for a fixed price. That's what I believe in. I want to make a game that's artistic and has a message and so on. And that occasionally those two are at odds. In fact, often they're at odds. Occasionally we do find that there's someone who's on their life path, has a perfect intersection, fortunately, with what the market feels like paying for. And we love to elevate these stories because they have them at speakers at IGF, etc. Of like, someone goes out on their stage and says, I just made whatever I felt like and the market loved it, and this is what we should all do. Obviously, the reality, I think most of you probably know this by now, is that most people who just do whatever they feel like, the market turns out to be saturated for things like pixelated platformers, etc., etc., etc. Not that there's anything wrong with those, except to say that that's a decision in the direction of I feel like making this, as opposed to this is what the market currently has a niche, unfulfilled niche demand for. Now, another story I want to share from this is actually going to be from far longer ago. Unlike these other stories that are all from the past decade, this is actually from 1850s. This is Walden by Henry David Thoreau, book that's very important to me in my life. This is particularly an 1899 copy, which I don't have a lot of things that I don't have a lot of material objects I'm very into. This is one of my objects I like to protect and hang on to. And now I want to establish too, because this is literally 1850s, so a long time ago, literally like a decade before the Civil War ended and before Abraham Lincoln's demise and so on. I mean, this is 1850s. He's going to do some things. Like he refers to this character here as the Indian, which I know is uncomfortable, and that's not how we talk about things today. We have to understand, and there's a better message in here than his choice of words from 1850s, but we're gonna do this. And this is from page 18, so this is still very early. And by the way, for context, so if you don't know details of Walden, I know many of the people watching this video probably do, but I also know I have some younger listeners and some listeners who maybe are in different cultures that don't follow the same Western literary tradition of caring about Walden necessarily. Is a book about a man, Henry David Thoreau, self-written about his own story, who decided that places like Boston were too crowded. He felt like people got caught up in that life of trying to constantly own more, succeed more in the way that the city evaluated, that it was too crowded. And so he chose to instead live next to Walden Pond, it's the name of the book, in as simple a fashion as possible. Built himself a simple little log cabin, big enough for his bed and a little bit of his table with notes and whatever. And aside from that, lived off of fishing, growing a small plot of land, occasionally visiting friends or having them visit him and so on. Not 100% isolated, but really just trying to live a simpler life with fewer things and seeing what he learned in the process. That's what the book's all about. So this is from an early section, meaning he's still kind of figuring out that that's where he's steering towards. Not long since, a strolling Indian went to sell baskets at the house of a well-known lawyer in my neighborhood. "Do you wish to buy any baskets?" he asked. "No, we do not want any," was the reply. "What?" exclaimed the Indian as he went out the gate. "Do you mean to starve us?" Having seen his industrious neighbors so well off, that the lawyer had only to weave arguments, and by some magic, wealth and standing followed, he had said to himself, "I will go into business. I will weave baskets. It is a thing which I can do." Thinking that when he had made the baskets, he would have done his part, and then it would be the other man's to buy them. He had not discovered that it was necessary for him to make it worth the other's while to buy them, or at least make him think it was so, or to make something else which it would be worth his while to buy. I too, I here being Henry David Thoreau, had woven a kind of basket of a delicate texture, but I had not made it worth anyone's while to buy them. Yet not the less, in my case, did I think it worth my while to weave them, and instead of studying how to make it worth men's while to buy my baskets, I studied rather how to avoid the necessity of selling them. The life which men praise and regard as successful is but one kind. Why should we exaggerate any one kind at the expense of the others? And again, recap. I realize some of this is a little bit slightly archaic language. Not terribly so, but a little bit. We have a guy he's a basket weaver, selling baskets door to door, and expects, because he's made a basket, that somebody else who has more money, the lawyer, should pay him money for his baskets. Now, if you don't see the analog here to the game development scene, the indie game scene in particular, where lots of people's feeling is that, well, they can make a game and they have made a game, so someone else with money should therefore give them money for that game, and they feel entitled to that money and frustrated when it doesn't happen. They run into that same barrier of not realizing that you have to make it worth that person's while to buy it, or make it seem so. So either building a better product or marketing it better, or as he said, the other case, make something else entirely. Maybe they don't want that thing you built. Maybe they want something else entirely. And if you're really interested in the game design and building games, then in a way, at that point, you're putting the customer into the driver's seat. They're the designer, which, if you're doing it as a business, maybe is fine. But if you're doing it for personal fulfillment because there's game ideas you have that you want to realize and you want to see and you want to build, then maybe we start looking at what Henry David Thoreau's solution was. He asked instead, how do I avoid having to sell my baskets? And he did this in many different ways, right? I mean, like talked about the overarching path of the story. He lowered his expenses tremendously from what other people paid in the sort of city environments. He found a way to be able to fend for himself in other means. And in fact, it's actually another case from further down in here. Let me grab this one. For myself, I found that the occupation of a day laborer was the most independent of any. Continues in the next sentence. The laborer's day ends with the going down of the sun, and he is then free to devote himself to his chosen pursuit, independent of his labor. But his employer, who speculates from month to month, has no respite from one end of the year to the other. And this is exactly the kind of transformation. I mean, this is literally 1850s talk for found there was freedom in keeping a day job. I think that today many people are still on that back and forth on whether or not it makes sense for their path. When he realized that when he tried to do things as his business, or the person who chooses to be the entrepreneur, the studio founder, they constantly have to be stressing over 24 hours a day, am I on the right path? Am I serving my customers? Will this business still exist in 2 months? Because that pressure's on them. Versus the people who choose the path of the day laborer can, when work ends, put it down and step away from it and be free to pursue their chosen pursuits and passions and their other hours. Not to say that's everyone's path, but again, it's actually when I increasingly see common among people who are in game development because there's a game they want to build and they don't want the pressures of it to come from, here's what the market demands from me right now. They choose to make a lighter weight version. Now, there's still a way to build a bridge between these two. These are not totally discrete ends of the spectrum, as you'll see from my portfolio, the previous video. Occasionally what happened was I would build something out of passion for a side project, separate from my day job at the time, depending on what year of my life we're talking about. And if and when that free, simple project that I put together with literally no budget, if and when that proved that there was traction, because it got festival recognition, or because it picked up a lot of traction of internet players, or it got discussed in articles or whatever, that's when I would then revisit that and then reinvest in it more seriously as a commercial project. And in many cases, make back a return that way. But it began by just building and putting out there kind of proof of concepts, if you will, fishing line in the water, to see where, if anybody bites, because most of the time they don't, and that's fine. But to realize that if they don't bite on that simple version, then any more energy, time, or especially money spent on it might have been wasted, rather than having figured out first, where's their nibbling going on, if you will, if you don't mind the multiple metaphors in a row. But it is to say, again, what do you want out of it? Because I can tell you what I want out of it, and you'll see it in the previous video. I practice what I preach. But each person wants something different out of it. And if what you really want is to make a lot of money doing it, are you willing to do that if it means making games that aren't the games you feel like making? Because that's a lot of money on the table right there for making games that people aren't as into making. Or would you rather find some other way to not have to sell your games? Which I know does not sound as appealing, doesn't sound as awesome. Realize oftentimes we have this scenario of, well, I should just do whatever I feel like doing, and then I want to make all my money doing that. One person who I phrased this question to, I loved his answer because of what it helped surface. And he said, okay, well, what I'd want to do is I'd want to make that game that sells really well so that then I could work on whatever I wanted. Did you catch that? He'd first make the compromises to do some other game he didn't really care for to make enough money from that to be able to afford to do what he wanted. Now, here's the thing. if literally we're doing this as work that we're not passionate about, that's not what we believed in and not what we were after doing, except to say to subsidize the cost of being able to have the freedom and flexibility to do this other thing that we'd like to do, this other game, our way. In that case, turns out making video games, especially original video games, self-published video games, is maybe not the most efficient means for someone who has those skills in design, engineering, project management, marketing, art, whatever it might be, writing. That may not be the most marketable, high-value, reliable return on investment for those skills compared to lots of folks I know who find a reliable job at Microsoft or Google or some other big company, Apple, who can pay reliably, steadier long-term work, less volatility of every 2 years laying everybody off and shifting people around, less volatility in terms of this year it's VR, last year was this, next year it's going to be that. And that many people soon, once they realize that what I'm really after is finding a way to do my own games, when you make the point, you don't actually have to do this, the big successful commercial game that makes money, before you start building the games you want to build in the hours and the time that you have. When you realize that this isn't actually a barrier to it, in many cases it's a distraction. It's one of the reasons why we see so many people. I remember part of what opened up my interviewing process for game developers. One of my first interviews I did was Warren Robnett. It's like 2009. Warren Robnett made Adventure for Atari. We're talking yellow dot, walking around the screen, fighting little dragons that look like ducks, picking up an arrow for a sword, could carry one object at a time. I mean, the game literally invented, as far as I'm concerned, the convention that Zelda used of when you walk to the edge of the screen, poof, you're in a new room. That hadn't been done yet. We're talking 1977. So Warren Robnett invented all that stuff, again, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly popularized it. And I was partly having that interview because I was trying to figure out, why did people leave the game industry? Why did someone who put in the time, energy, and effort to be successful in making games stop making games? And that began my search with people who back then were doing it. And now anymore on my podcasting and GameKeto.community, I talk to a lot of people and I try to figure out, like, how are they still in it? How is it different from what they used to do? And in some cases, why'd they stop doing it professionally if they no longer do it in the same way or fashion that they used to? And what I've come to realize is that game industry changes so much every few years. Literally every 3 to 5 years, payment models change, schemes change, demographics change, markets change, platforms change, multi-touch accelerometers, touchpads, online play. And what happens is, in many cases, many people's story, it's like it goes back to this first point I made of, they'll grow up playing a certain kind of game. They fall in love with that kind of game. By the time that they have had enough experience building their way up to the point where they can be building things in industry, the market has changed. It doesn't want the things that they grew up with anymore. It wants a different kind of game. That may not be what they feel is into. And so for a lot of people, that's where their story stops, or they stop making games. And that's where I realized, when that was what was happening, that the kind of games that I was working on in studios weren't the kind of games I necessarily loved or had an interest in building, or didn't feel like I was enjoying the process of as much. My solution was to find some other way, through research, through teaching, through writing, through every other thing that I could do, to continue to support the fact that I just wanted to keep making the games I felt like making. That's what was important to me, being able to build games. And another reason for this is that when you can build the games that you feel like making, I'm obviously being, again, pretty clear on my bias of which side I personally have chosen, but when you can build the games that you want to build, you're able to learn much quicker where your understanding is disconnected, where are the cracks and gaps in how you think things should be done. Because what happens is that if you're instead building things not for your own, not to try out your own ideas, but for somebody else's hired you to do it, or the customer's paying you to do it, or whatever it is, then you wind up having to test their theories and not yours. Does that make sense? Because if someone's entry level, they're like, hey, I have an idea how I want to do this. Their boss says, no. Here's what the competitor did that's published provable that we know is profitable. You got to clone what they did, do that part. Here's our answer so we can just move forward on this project. Next level up, the person higher in the command, they think, okay, now I've made a promotion. Now I get to have to call the shots. No. Once again, the executive producer says, no, let's do this tried and true solution because we got to steer towards what we know is going to recoup these costs. Next level up, you start thinking, okay, finally, I started the company. I'm the executive. I started this company. It's my company. Can I call the shots now? And no. If it's a big enough company, it's investors. If it's a smaller company, at the very least, the customers, ultimately, like I said earlier, are getting to steer that design. And there's another expression from this, which I can't even recall which page it's on off the top of my head, but it is the point that men are not so much the keepers of herds as herds are the keepers of men. And again, this is Henry David Thoreau from Walden, pointing out that sometimes these things that people think that they have won, whether it's a big company, whether it's a bunch of customers, whether it's a bunch of property, to realize that is in many ways anchoring or limiting or controlling or constraining their freedom, as compared to if they found a way to not need that at that scale. Does that make sense? We're talking about a lot of things here at once, but I think there's all quite a bit of overlap. And, there's more we could say on this. There's a lot of things I think to dig in deeper, but I want to end it here because I don't want to go on too long. I know it's already been a slow video compared to my portfolio video, or certainly I know Laudio came in on my rapid hacking prototype demonstration for Snake. But think about that. Again, don't just passively watch this and just spectate. Think about, for you, 10 years from now, looking back on it, if you had to pick one or the other. And ideally, I wish that you find a way to make these two overlap in a perfect Venn diagram. But if it really came down to deciding one or the other, close your eyes and picture 10 years in the future. Would you rather look back and feel like you were commercially very successful, building games that weren't the games that you wanted to build? Or instead, would you rather feel like you built the games that you wanted to build? And you got to get those ideas out, you got to try your theories. In many cases, for me at least, as one closing note, I measured my success on the projects not by how many people played them or how well they sold. Some were played by a lot of people, some sold pretty well. I mention those because I know other people care about those things. Success to me was that I built the thing I wanted to build. That I set down a flag and said, here's what I'm building, and I built it the way I thought it ought to be built. So that's all for today. Chris here for Gamketo. Thank you for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed, please check out the subscribe button down below. Have more videos for you all soon. Look forward to playing your games in the future.